Members reach quorum at the allotted time. First item agenda, election of the chairman. And since the chairman of the Welfare Service Panel hoped that I would chair this meeting, do we all agree? Yes, thank you. So in the capacity of the Joint Channel Meeting Chairman, I shall preside over this meeting. Today, this topic is tenancy control. The document has been listed in the revised agenda. And thank you for the administration and deputations for coming. Today, we have a total of 36 deputations and individuals registered. And one of them, organization, have submitted a commission deputation but will not attend. So the meeting will be conducted in 2 sessions with a break at 3:35 for 5 minutes. And last week we have notified the members that since there are a lot of deputations who will come to express their views, so the 2 panel will hold another joint panel meeting on the July the 6th at 10:45 in the morning to listen to the views on tenancy control on 30 other deputations. Now can we invite the deputations into the room, please? And also the administration representatives, please.
有啲團體代表，因為佢哋喺下低做緊安檢。
Some of the deputations are being registered at the counter, so we need to wait for a few more minutes. I have to read out a spiel in their presence. So just wait for a few more minutes. Might remind deputations and individuals, if you like to listen to the allows, because this channel 0 is the floor, 1 is Cantonese, 2 is English, and 2 is English, 3 is Putonghua. So you'll be given 3 minutes, and your submissions and opinions will not be protected by the covered by the protection immunity provided under the Legislative Council Powers and Privileges Ordinance Cap 382. And please note the security measures set out in the note for members of the public attending meetings in conference room or observing meetings in public galleries in the electrical complex, which have been tabled in front of you. And you have prepared your submission. Please write down your name. And before you leave the meeting, will please hand it over to our staff for the members' reference. May we have the deputation speak first before the administrator responded, or you prefer the other way? We come to listen to the voice of the public, so I shall let the deputation speak first. First, Mr. Mok Kam Sung. As we understand, the climbing property prices is about the supply and demand imbalance. and the tenancy value is pegged to the selling price. We have been renting for 7 years, and I have much reservations on tenancy control. I think it's only a band-aid solution. I understand when the public hear about the tenancy control by instinct, they will feel that they were able to lower the rent, which seems to have a regulation mechanism in place. And we see in European countries in the 21st century to implement tenancy control, the market reaction have been counterproductive, and the negative consequences to the unprivileged will be more acute. And what is the impact to tenants and landlords on tenancy control? Since it will suppress the rent levels, and the landlords will ask for a higher offer to compensate for the future income loss. By then, there will lead to an increase before the regulation, and the unleased flats will also have a high asking price. It would also lead to a reduced supply of rental units, and under so much restrictions, the landlords have less incentive to lease out their flats, and even inclined to leave it vacant for sale or to turn it into their second home. And there are a lot of doubts that the landlords would prefer leaving it vacant instead of making money. For the past 2 years, we can see as the tightening of the weekly visit policy, we can see a lot of empty shop fronts. So they probably will cost more than the rental units. And these shops have been letting out under short-term tenancies. From the tenant perspective, if rental control has afforded protection on standing tenancies, it can anticipate it that the landlord will be more selective in choosing their tenants in order to avoid undesirable tenants. For example, those on non-stable income, for example, EMs, disadvantaged and the old and the weak. In the future, they may be more difficult for them to get the units they need and be fallen victim under this policy. The high rent prices due to the insufficient supply. Please do distract the focus. Next, Mr. Kwok Wing Kin. Today, I'm supporting into setting up tenancy control in Hong Kong. In 2004, the rental control was abolished on 3 grounds. There was sufficient supply, the sliding rents in private market, and affordable housing has been plentiful. Back then, the wasting time for 2.6 years. And for fast forward to now, these 3 reasons would hold. So there'll be long waiting lines for public housing, and with expensive private housing, it's time to reconsider to setting up tenancy control to ensure our right to leasing. Does our tenancy control be equivalent to rent control, or the same form in the past? A lot of the countries have told and informed us that the tenancy control come in many forms. The new generation of tenancy controls focus on the right to renewal and the control the extent of rent increase. Very often we see that the landlords have a substantial rent increase essentially not to let the tenancy expire. There will be rent increase every year. If they can't afford it, they will be forced to move elsewhere or to get cheaper accommodation. And every relocation, they will have discard furniture and to secure the service of the mover, which involves a lot of expenses. A new generation of tenancy control has not the same job in the past in restricting the rent increases, and also protect the public for their tenancy security and able to stay on their premises for a longer period of time. So we support tenancy control. Some claims that as a free market, we should let the market to adjust itself. As you can see, that the housing market is not entirely perfectly competitive market, and for different units have different searching costs and price discrimination. Since this is a not a fully competitive market, the government should intervene to protect the public livelihood. Whether for an Ambrose Chung and for Mr. Frank Chan, it seems ignoring the problem. And a lot of the grassroots their needs have been rendered invisible, which is unscriptable. We have to advocate for the setting of tenancy control now. Next, Mr. Yu Tak-po. Yu Tak-po of the Civic Party. I think the high property prices is out of reach for the most of the public. The market regulation mechanism is ineffective and led to inequitable distribution of social wealth, and using the excuse of free market to deprive the public of the right to accommodation is the neglect of duty on the part of administration. The root cause of this was the government to fail to provide adequate housing and fail to develop more land. For example, enact the land resumption ordinance to get back the land hoarded by the developers. And today's problem, it was a consequence of misguided policies. The Civic Party is of the view that it's time to adjust the imbalance and hope to fundamentally address the housing shortage. We propose that the government should have a fair distribution of the ready of land so as to boosting the public housing supply to satisfy the needs of the grassroots residents. At the same time, the government should consider levying vacancy tax and value-added tax to boost the supply of first-hand units and to stop the non-local residents and their companies to purchasing local properties and for resale, so as to push up property prices. I think these two measures should boost housing supply and hopefully can address the housing issue. And rent control doesn't mean tenancy control. After the handover, the security of tenancy and rent control have been abolished in 1998 and 2004. The tenants have lost their right for renewal to only be evicted on a month notice, and though they failed to have a stable roof over their head. In the face of acute shortage, the administration can conduct public consultation on tenancy control and set up a review timetable to look into how what was the negative impact on rental control as balance the rights of landlords and tenants. The right to accommodation is a basic human right. The administration is obligated to ensure that the public should live in acceptable and satisfactory housing. And they also should protect the disadvantaged. Next, Mr. Park Chung-kei. I would want to look into a social phenomenon. Why those who oppose against government policies turn out to be very supportive of it. There's one major movie figure claims that the Chinese should be managed. So in face of unjust social phenomenon, why is the government not doing something about it? So I would like to discuss the cognitive dissonance. And please don't mix up engaging code mixing, otherwise it will be hard for these simultaneous interpreters. The Hong government has been this non-interventionist policy. However, today's administration claims it's outdated. From the Lion Rock Institute point of view, to govern a society, especially without a popular mandate, the less intervention, the less antagonism you would get. However, the public views on today's administration on tenancy control for the exact mechanism. Every time the tenancy control will never last too long, only be abolished at the end. As we all know, they would only reduce supply. However, when the leftists agree the government should increase housing supply, even when the golf course should be bulldozed for development, I'm supporting policies to reduce the housing supply. Is there some sort of dissonance? Every time the government proposes building more public housing, the first reaction probably claims that it will benefit the new privileged class, for example, new immigrants, the well-off tenants, and so on. How enforcing the rent reduction, those benefit, of course, will be happy for those without unsecured income, those without a nice curriculum vitae, and a young who've just joined the society want to and have their own place, and the landlords will not rent to you.
When our next generation is in phase of this kind of conflict between two generations, what are they going to do? Recently, Mr. Leung Kam-chung said that Hong Kong should have a population of 10 million people in order to dovetail with the development in the Greater Bay Area. And if you really want to do that, tenancy control actually would be best, because the younger generation would all be forced out of Hong Kong and would end up in Guangzhou, because they won't be able to find any housing in Hong Kong, and so they all have to end up in the Greater Bay region. So I hope that the leftists should really think this through. Are you really reducing yourselves to being the tool for the government to extend its powers? Mr. Zhang Chonghang? Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are on tenancy control. Tenancy control actually has been implemented and cancelled twice in Hong Kong, and this is the third time we talk about it. If you look at the background information, the research section of LegCo actually has released a report dated 2014 concerning designated locations tenancy control. And so it has looked at foreign experiences with regard to the penalties and also the systems for various tenancy control mechanisms being implemented all over the world. And so we are talking about housing now. So what exactly is housing? Is housing an item of luxury, or is it an item of necessity? It seems that nobody has ever been able to come to a consensus on this particular issue. Now, it seems that if you look at it from a purely theoretical point of view, housing is a luxury. And property actually is a luxury. But in Hong Kong, we really have to think about whether residential properties are also luxury items. Now, residential properties are supposed to house people, and there are various categories. We've got luxury flats, and we've got public housing flats, and so on and so forth. It seems that there is no clear-cut demarcation in Hong Kong's housing policy. And every time a housing policy is being implemented, there will be chain effects. Now, tenancy control on the face of it seems to offer certain advantages, and it would definitely protect incumbent tenants. And also it would protect incumbent residents of a particular neighborhood, because it would be difficult for landlords to evict their tenants. And so if you can have a steady residence without much mobility in a particular neighborhood, then it would really be conducive to the cultivation of a sense of belonging among residents towards that particular neighborhood. And so they would feel a more sense of belonging towards that neighborhood, and they don't have to worry too much about rental increase, and as a result, they don't have to worry about saving up too much money or excessively money in order to cover possible future increases of rental. And so they can devote more of their financial resources to entertainment and to recreation. And also, if you have a steady neighborhood with less mobility, then fewer people will be moving houses, and that will be more environmentally friendly. But of course, there are the downsides to tenancy control, and some economists have pointed out that tenancy control actually is bad, because the landlords won't be able to make money. I'm sorry, your time is up. Next speaker, Madam Tang Hao Ting. And property prices in Hong Kong continue to skyrocket and break records, and so they have become quite beyond the affordability of most members of the public, and grassrooters and those who are living in partition flats are really very much bothered by excessive rentals. And so many grassrooters actually are in very dire situation. And recently I visited a resident of petition flat who is living in Pt1, and he is paying $5,000 per month for his tiny flat. And also, he has been charged excessive utility charges because utility charges are not controlled by the government. So I would like to take this opportunity to propose a three-pronged approach: tenancy control, and also a vacancy tax, and also tenancy subsidies. At present, the waiting list of public housing is as long as 270,000, and the average waiting time is 4.7 years, and this figure is only going to go up. And so definitely the government has not been able to meet the target of 3 years on the waiting list. And so the government must offer rental subsidy, and the amount must be at least $1,800 and should be adjustable in accordance with family size. And the next possible approach, of course, is tenancy control. I hope that the government can review the landlord and tenants ordinance, so that regular private property flats should be subject to control, and also the rental increase must not be 10% above the rateable value. Now, as for the petition flats, for lease flats, they should be subject to special control, and rental increase range allowed for petition flats should be less than 10% and should not be above market level. Finally, about the vacancy tax, I think for residential units in Hong Kong, they should be subject to vacancy tax if they remain vacant beyond a certain period of time. I think all of these three solutions are needed before we can solve housing problems, especially in Pt1. I hope that this can be given due attention. Madam Zhang. The past government papers have listed reasons against tenancy control. Now, first of all, it says that it will reduce housing supply. If that is the case, then why doesn't the government consider vacancy tax? And it also says that disadvantaged groups will actually have less access to housing. Now, that actually can be solved by government's mechanism for social housing. And the third reason against is that utility charges will become excessive. In Netherlands, actually, they also have tenancy control, and also they have this covered. Now, for utility charges in Netherlands, they all have to be tabulated very clearly in the invoice for rental, and also it cannot be 20% above market level. Now, there are many high-ranking officials within the government, and sure, they will be able to come up with solutions. And the fourth reason against is that the landlords will be losing incentive to maintain their flats. Now, if you go out onto our streets, and if you have looked at our grassroots residences, you know that many petition flats are within tenement buildings, and the landlords of tenement buildings are actually waiting for their tenement buildings to be bought out by developers. And so they're neglecting their flats anyway. They're simply sitting there and waiting for their flats to be bought out. So the situation is already existing on the ground, and it's already quite serious. So that's not any reason against tenancy control. And I also would like to give a response to Lions Hills Club's representation. They are saying that if there is more intervention, then there will be more backlash. Now, if that is the ground for not doing any intervention, then what's the use for the government? The government's role is to redistribute social resources and wealth so that everybody can have reasonable access to a fair share of resources. There is a lot of social imbalance in our community already, and that's why there is a very large number of petition flats existing in our city. And this is all because property prices are too high and housing resources are not fairly distributed. So the government has to step in and redistribute housing resources. And then it's been claimed that leftists actually have mental dichotomy and claiming that we are really proposing tenancy control, which would actually result in housing supply. Now, to respond to that, we understand that providing more lands is going to take time, but people who are staying at petition flats are already in dire situation, even as we speak, day in and day out, and so we must help them immediately. Madam Lee, now there are many issues involved in tenancy control. I'd like to talk about the following. What is the attitude of the government towards this, and also DAB's attitude towards this? I think the attitude is shameless. And whenever there is a call for tenancy control, they use two reasons to go against it. First of all, it is very difficult for them to ascertain that indeed there is excessive rental and excessive charging of utility charges. Now, Mr. Chen Fan, actually you have visited the petition flats, and how can you not be sure that such a situation already exists? And also you say that Kai Fongs and residents should actually come forth and take up prosecution against landlords. But the responsibility of prosecution should not rest on Kai Fongs, but actually should be on the government. And you also say that if you were to legislate for tenancy control, it's going to be administratively very expensive, and also staff costs is going to be exorbitant. And that's why it's not worth it. But we are talking about government's money here. And also, you've got a lot of very huge infrastructural projects that have suffered very excessively from cost overruns, such as the high-speed railway to the tune of 100 or even 200 or 10 to 2 billion, $20 billion. And on the other hand, when private members' bill was being put forward for tenancy control, you simply banned them. And the government simply refused to come forth with any clear-cut explanation. And so the private members' bill is being banned. And so what is going to be your replacement solution? The problem still exists on the ground, and what the government is going to do to follow up on it. And many of us deputations and many Kai Fongs have put together a campaign. We hope that not only Kai Fongs will be airing their views, but we hope that when we are putting together campaigns on the street, the government will also give a response. And Mr. Chen Fan, your assistant has already taken our letter outside, and but he said that he was going to refrain from giving us a direct answer, deferring to you. But now you are seated here in front of us, and we've got Assistant Director for Social Services here, and so I'm going to ask you this question. If indeed your home was being robbed, and then the spoil was being sold on the street, and this is something that happens every day. Your home is being robbed every day, and spoils from your home are being sold on the street every day. Then what are you going to do? What are you going to do in response to that? I think this is exactly what's happening, because government's money is being robbed every day. Mr. Zhang, I would like to speak on behalf of To Kwa Wan residents. They are grassroots, and they have never nursed the thoughts of buying flats. And so their only option is to rent. But if rentals become too high, then what other options do they have? Now, concerning tenancy control, as well as vacancy tax, and also automatic right for renewal, I think all these solutions are needed. And the residents in To Kwa Wan are already living in smaller and smaller flats and paying higher and higher rental. And it seems that the government has already resigned to accepting this, leaving these residents to their own fate. And many residents in To Kwa Wan are already living in petition flats. And their biggest problem is indeed housing. Some of them may already have a stable job. However, most of the income will have to go to paying for rent. And so the money that's left after paying rent actually is very little. So for those that have not yet been allocated public housing and are living in partition flats, they are really in very dire situation. The MTR is going to become accessible to To Kwa Wan. And is it going to be a good thing for To Kwa Wan? And To Kwa Wan residents are already very worried because it might give landlord an excuse to raise rent. And also they are really afraid that they could be evicted by the tenants, and they're already living in very poor conditions. And if rentals continue to go up, they would find them simply unaffordable. And so where are they going to end up at? And between April and June, 3 residents have shared with me that their landlords actually have subject them to an increase of rental of $800 to $1,000, and the landlords are saying that if they cannot afford it, they can simply move out. And so this is a very, very sad situation, and the landlords are really maximizing their right to increase rental. And what is very unfortunate is that the government is turning a blind eye to it, and they're giving a free hand to the landlords to raise rent. And so can the government say that they have been responsible towards the residents that are suffering? And rental increase is totally out of pack with inflation and totally out of pack with affordability of residents. It's totally dependent on market force. Now, if this goes on, then where are the grassroots residents going to end up at? Are they going to end up at McDonald's, or are they going to end up underneath a flyover and within pedestrian subways? And also, if residents are being forced to move out of their flats, they have to expend quite a bit of money in order to move houses. And so that takes even more financial resources out of them. And so if rents become unaffordable to grassroots, where are they going to end up at?
Chen Wei-ying, I'm representing the Pt1 residents. Hope the administration could regulate the rent to set up tenancy controls, for example, on subdivided units, so that the young children could have a holistic development and better family harmony. And this. So today we're not living in satisfactory condition. Where do we have the harmony? And do we not have a peaceful society? So we want to improve the society. To start with, everyone should have a roof over their head, so that people can be happy and put a smile on their face. Why decide not to enact the tenancy control? For all the talk, so many years, the government have turned a blind eye. We have so many talents in the government. So would they be focused on white elephant projects but not resolving livelihood issues? Are you forcing us to go into the mental asylum, or force us to jump off the roof? So for all the lands you've identified for housing, you can just turn it straight into mental asylum. The SDU residents are living in cramped conditions with poor air quality and made us sick. While the administration's officials have ever tried living in SDUs, and would have 2 people living in the lower bunk bed, and 2 other members living on the upper bunk. Have we tried these before? How harmonious can this household get? So when there's a dispute between a couple, how is that resolved? The SDU are in inhumane conditions. We very much want the officials against tenancy control to try out the SDU themselves. They're very bad, poor air quality with a lot of rodents and cockroaches, and made everyone angry. There are mosquitoes in summer, and we're paying exorbitant amount of rents and utilities. Is it all reasonable? How can you face these residents to this end? Next, Ms. Chang Yi-hung. I support tenancy control. Why had the tenancy control not implemented for so long? You probably know well about the figures in SDU housing, and you very much be aware of the problems we're facing. Why decide not to act on such injustice and fail to regulate? Why not implement tenancy control? We've been greatly oppressed. Every time the landlord proposes a rent hike, we'll be panicking. We already live in bad conditions, and yet we have no bargaining power. We only accept the proposed increase to residents. We heard about this $1,000 per month rent increases. They are simply robbing us. we simply could not afford this rate of increase, and we're not able to provide for our children in such living small conditions, and I almost fell on the brink of mental illness. The grassroots are living very tough and yet ignored by all. Where have all the government officials? And they fail to empathize with us. Don't understand how much hardship we're in. So the officials are living grand mansions, and while turning a blind eye to our hardship while we're living in hell. Have you imagined the hardship living in rooftop houses and SDUs, and what have you done for us? I just want to live more comfortably instead of subject to annual rate increases or the risk of eviction. Thank you. Mr. Ho Kai Sing. Today's theme is tenancy control. The public hearing should be open to everyone who would like to express their views for administration residents. However, they will need to work or take care of children thus not able to attend. Would you consider rescheduling the public hearing? I'm speaking on behalf of those not able to attend. As we all know, the private property prices stay at very high levels, and the waiting time for a public housing unit keep on increasing. According to housing departments, the average waiting time extends from 4.7 to 5.1 years. The grassroots could only be waiting indefinitely in the STUs. Imagine if the residents make as much as the secretary, would it still remain stay in STU? The rate increases get more outrageous by the year. For a unit of over 100 square foot, it could cost over 5,000 to 6,000. For those who make 10,000 out a month, if their income the rent made up 2/3 of their income, how would they make the ends meet? Such an unreasonable rent increase, the tenants would be only underwaiting, and currently the tenancy agreements are not able to protect the rights of the tenants. Besides, the offering a tenancy agreement for the first 2 years, we extend by oral agreement, so they could be evicted within 1 month. So be indefinite wait for public housing, yet we can afford private housing. And while waiting for public housing, they will subject to injustice in the private housing. Hope that tenancy control by a standard agreement. Hope that there could be a written agreement and put in the stamp duty to ensure the legitimacy. They also have a priority right of renewal. And unless they would take to repossessed or for their relatives, and also the extent increase should be restricted or pegged to the CPIA. Some think that they will reduce the housing supply or landlord be more selective. The residents have told us that even this problem exists without tenancy control, and the landlord will ask that have you applied for CSA? And they will only, if you apply a recipient of it, they will only rent to you due to better income security. So government should just act directly to implement tenancy control. And we can all legislate to regulate. And finally, tenancy control is to protect the rights of the landlords and the interests, and so as to prevent abuse by intermediary on the grassroots. I hope the administration should relaunch tenancy control. Next, Ms. Leong Wai-ling. And speaking on behalf of the grassroots elderly, I'm also a resident of Pt1. The Sha-Tin Central Lane is about commission very soon, and this year the rent increase has been staggering. We've seen the property ages a 300 square foot unit in the same building. Back in 2017, May, $8,000. Now, been increased to $12,000. Yesterday, I gone back. The rent had increased to $14,000. There's all this severe inflation. For those elderly with little savings, additional stress for them while waiting for public housing. They'll be under threat of eviction and rent increases, which affect their health. They're worried about their savings running out. They will have no choice but to return to work. However, most of the work for the elderly required physical labor and long hours. Those who could not get employment were forced to pick up cotton boxes to supplement their income. This is greatly detrimental to the elderly's health and add to the healthcare costs to the government. By then, the rent keep increasing, the income only cover part of the rent, and not even enough to cover the rent, which they need to dig up their own savings to pay for the rent and living expenses and healthcare costs, which is ever rising. They could only live smaller and smaller in poor conditions. For those mobility impaired, for them to climb the stairs will be a very hard time for them, and the elderly lose their dignity. One elderly has very sick every year. They have to pay the heavy medical costs of $150 per day. However, for the entire year, he did not get any government assistance. He won't apply to the Welfare Service Department. Yet the asset limit is over $40,000. Thus, he's ineligible for any assistance. So he had no choice but to exhaust his own savings. But he exhausted savings, he couldn't make his rent. While waiting for public housing, they would wait for about 3 years. They could only keep on waiting. Once the elderly exhaust their savings, would it be wait till their death or living on the streets? The concerned group property officials can be sympathetic to the government's elderly on the contribution to the society when they're younger. I couldn't imagine that there was such a hard time in retirement. Hope that the officials could expedite the launch of tenancy control and regulate the utility charges for the first right of renewal and the regulated intermediaries to help the landlords in helping the tenants. Next, Mr. Ho Chuk-hin. It's ridiculous enough for Hong Kong to have subdivided units. So we pride home everything else. Yes, the free market economy have rendered us in such poor living conditions. We're talking tens of thousands of people living in STUs. And tenancy is another cause of the factor. In my work, I came across in Canton Road, there's half the street being evicted by repossession. They were required to leave within a month, and it was almost Chinese New Year. A lot of the tenants, well, because these are very grassroots residents, they are probably further subletting, and found that a lot of the sublet landlord did not sign tenancies with their tenants. The Hong Kong legislation had rendered a lot of tenants without a tenancy agreement, and they could be subject to rent increases at the whim of a hat. And for the dilapidated units and the responsibility for maintenance is unclear. So there's no tenancy agreement to refer to for any damages to the rental unit. Who shall be responsible? So at the time of eviction, these tenants who haven't signed any tenancy agreements had no bargaining power, let alone bargaining with the landlord. If we don't unite together to take action, they will even get a chance to talk to the landlord. And for this 10-year security, what I've dealt with is only tip of the iceberg. The severe imbalance between the landlord and the tenants as created by the government, that the tenants feel free to exploit the poor. So without intervention, does that equate to freedom? Well, just like the Lions Rock Institute deputation claims, this is a kind of freedom. For such non-interventionist freedom, would that belong to those with the power and the money, or those that belong to the poor and disadvantaged? Or they claim that the left thought unwittingly become a tool of government expansionist power. On the other hand, and this is also for the landlord expand their own power. The big difference is that you deep down you know that you're deep proud of this goal. And the residents have come up different posters and hope to submit to the officials. Next, Mr. Chang Shi-kun. If you have anything to submit, please hand it over to our staff. Please return to your seats. Okay, we're on a tight schedule. Mr. Cheng Shi-kun. I'm a subdivided unit tenant, and our fellow residents might think that the tenancy agreement only favors the landlord. As tenants, we are in despair. We have no say at all.
For instance, for my subdivided unit, it is in disrepair, and I requested my landlords to fix it, but my landlord simply refused, and we had to fix the discrepant portions of my flat ourselves. For instance, a heater and so on and so forth, and the landlord simply said that we should use our own money to fix the flat. And by the time I have to move out of the flat, what am I going to do? Do I have to also move my heaters and also the other stuff that I've paid for? And nobody is helping us. And we cannot argue with the landlords. And if we attempt to argue with the landlords simply will slap a higher rent on us. So the government must reintroduce tenancy control to protect us tenants and also to protect landlords. Because if you've got legislation in place, then there won't be any room for argument and disputes. And we don't have to rely on a very unreliable tenancy agreement to settle disputes. And at present, the landlords have a free hand in increasing rents, and also utility charges are being levied excessively. And if the landlords don't like us, they simply can kick us out. And if we have to relocate ourselves, it's going to be very expensive. So we really hope that the government can lend a hand here. And I'd like to ask the convener, what about the attempt to solve the problem of excessive utility charges? Now, is there any solution in sight? Now, this is the time for you to ask questions. We're not going to give a response at this point in time. Are you done? Yes. Mr. Leung Chee-kwan. I speak on behalf of grassrooters who've been suffering on a very long-term basis from excessive rental. Now, we are only afforded 3 minutes, and the grassroots residents are speaking their mind and speaking their true feelings, and the officials are here to listen to us. Now, at present, there are 92,000 subdivided units housing 200,000 people. And there has been a report saying that the rental index for subdivided units has increased by 4.5%. And rental as a percentage of income has increased by 3% from 33.9%. So tenants of subdivided units are really being hard-pressed by very high rental. And so I'd like to beseech government officials to reintroduce tenancy control so that rents can only be increased in accordance with Cat A price index. In Pt1, for example, the Shatin Central Link is going to be operational very, very soon. At present, the rental increase rate is really horrifying. It's like $1,000 every time or $2,000 every time even. And I think tenancy control must be reintroduced. Just imagine the grassroots are not making too much money. And so if you do not reintroduce tenancy control, it is going to be a disastrous situation happening very soon. And if you leave everything to the free market, then grassroots will suffer even more. And they will become hopeless. We hope that the officials can lend us assistance here. Tenancy control must be introduced as soon as possible. And there are very, very few conscionable landlords. And if you introduce tenancy control, then everybody's lot would be improved and people will live much happier in their own neighborhoods. Mr. Gam? For Pt1 residents, they cannot come to this meeting today, and so I'm speaking on their behalf. Mr. Donald Chung has once proposed that residents could actually live farther out in the new territories instead of living in the urban areas, and they can enjoy cheaper rent. But this is no longer true, because even in Pt1 and in North District, the shop venues and the shop properties are actually seeing increase in rental against a market trend. And subdivided flats in these areas actually are going for $4,000 to $5,000 every month. And so the rentals are no longer cheap. And this problem actually has started in 2008 and is worsening. And just now the Lion Hills Club member says that this should be left to the market. What I'm trying to say is that society changes all the time. And if society remains the same, then we don't need any civil servants at all, because the same policy could actually be used on an indefinite basis. What you are seeing on the ground is that rentals continue to increase, and people on the public housing waiting list already numbers $280,000, and the waiting time is already above 5 years. And the government is now abolishing rental allowance from the Care for the Underprivileged People Fund. So without rental allowance, and with such a long waiting time for public housing, then what the government can do to help the tenants? And tenancy control really is the only solution here. We are not trying to force landlords to cut their rent. We are saying that rent increase should be subject to a limited range, say 8 to 10%, and pegged to inflation. Grassrooters very rarely see their wages increase or adjusted in accordance with inflation. Yet the government refuses to offer any restriction and rental allowance. And also the Housing Bureau Secretary has also floated the idea of a conscionable tenancy agreement. And within the conscionable standardized agreement, there is a provision for, say, 3 months of notice for eviction and so on and so forth. We hope that the Secretary for Housing can actually give a response to conscionable tenancy agreement, and whether the government is going to help in putting this forward. And also will try to curtail excessively irregular behaviors by intermediaries and landlords. Mr. Poon Siping, Mr. Taman Ho, and another lawmaker have indicated that they want to speak. I think many of us would like to speak at this session. And Secretary of Housing, of course, you can respond to the deputation's views, but please be concise, because I want you to leave some time for members of the council as well. First of all, I would like to thank the deputations for telling us their own personal difficulties. And other deputations have spoken on behalf of residents who cannot attend this meeting. We do appreciate that. When housing supply is out of balance, rental levels are very, very high, and they have become quite unaffordable for tenants, especially those at the grassroots level. We hope that through various approaches, we will be able to address this issue. I've heard your views very clearly, and your views actually are very reasonable and sensible, and your requests are also very sensible. And indeed, you have painted us a very realistic picture of what's happening on the ground. And the first priority for the government really is to provide rental public housing for grassrooters, because this is a pledge of the government towards grassrooters. We do understand that public housing construction and supply really is unsatisfactory, and the waiting time is now increased from 4.8 years to 5.1 years. myself, as well as the housing department colleagues, have all felt very, very bad about this. We will continue to work on this. As for tenancy control and other proposals, to speak frankly, our objective really is not to do tenancy control or not. The bottom line is that whatever measures the government introduces and whether or not tenancy control is to be introduced, again, we really have to look at the outcome of so doing, whether it's going to be a negative outcome or a positive outcome. It has been pointed out by some of the deputations that indeed there will be some positive impact coming out of tenancy control. But then again, deputations seated here have also been fair in saying that 2014 was a time when we submitted tenancy control for review, and back then tenancy control has been found to be producing very undesirable consequences that have not been foreseen. And so you can see that the government has tried to target issues with alternative approaches. And for those of you who are in the field of social work and social welfare, you would know that any grassroots families that are renting private flats, and say if it's a 4P family, and if that family is receiving CSSA payment, then the monthly rental allowance is $5,000 or the actual rental that is being paid, whichever is lower. And also for families that are on employment, if they are on CSSA scheme, say a 4P family with 2 kids, if the working hours of the parents are above 190 hours, then every month they would be eligible for a allowance on a monthly basis of $3,000. And so I hope that you can also pay attention to those measures that the government has adopted outside of tenancy control. And also, we are in the process of providing social housing, and we are working in conjunction with social welfare organizations as well as developers to provide interim housing for people waiting for public rental housing allocation. So all of these measures show that the government is really alive to the problem of grassroots face in dealing with problem of housing. Indeed, the public housing program must continue to be expedited and continue to be fine-tuned. So please understand that we are not sitting on our bottom not doing anything. Now, when housing shortage is so serious, it is our firm conviction that if we were to reintroduce tenancy control, it would bring about counterproductive consequences. Because this session is going to end at 3:55, and we've got another session of deputations presentations. So if you cannot speak in this session, please wait for the next session. Mr. Wan Siu-Gay. I myself agree that there should be review on tenancy control. Just now, the Secretary for Housing has given a reply, and I was fortunate enough to be in this room in time to hear it. And I find that very, very weird. It seems that he has listed the difficulties that the government faces and the difficulties with tenancy control.
Government's position is that decide to do nothing. On one hand, you admit that the supply is short. I forgot which deputation mentioned that the government existed to serve a function to implement social policy intervention. Of course, the depth and the breadth can vary in order to achieve the rather a left or a rightward outcome, but currently there's no involvement. So there's a shortage of public housing, yet there's no rent subsidy. There's no review on tenancy control. I just cite some examples. So tenancy control may not have to do with rent restriction. So maybe the FTU mentioned some sort of regulations. For example, compulsory tenancy agreement. The EAA encouraged the SDU tenants from not signing the agreement. So actually there's no stamp duty if there's no agreement. So it's actually some kind of defrauding the government. Would you consider a review to consult the public on rent control and tenancy control, or even in drafting a standard tenancy agreement? Would you consider, like you admitted, that since there's an overall imbalance in housing or in terms of market intervention, would you consider offering some sort of rent subsidy measures? The third one, the government is aware already, so there's no stamp duty. There's no one to regulate the tenancy agreements. Would you consider reviewing that so that there would, well, probably not the small sum involved. There's still a lot of tenancy agreements. So over time, if you allow them to slip through the cracks, would you consider to act on it? Thank you, Ms. Vice Chairman's comments. As for the signing of the tenancy agreement, so when the tenants did not sign the tenancy agreement in some cases, and someone proposed of this some sort of a guidelines for the reference when drafting tenancy agreements. And this well-intended moves and must be realized with intention on both sides. The legislation may be considered. However, signing the agreement and to get a stamp duty would act to the transaction cost, and whether this transaction cost will pass on to the tenants. That must be considered. This is incorrect. So let's speak of economics. So that is some kind of a transaction cost borne by the tenants. I would see it from the tenant's point of view. So the money I paid out will be my commitment. Of course, the society as a whole would pay the cost. From the perspective of a grassroots family, what is paid out shall be their financial burden. So we need to think about how to turn this subsidy to pass directly on the affected families. Next, Mr. Kwok Wai Kang. A few questions by the Secretary. So I heard the Secretary been choking up, not weeping. So was it because you consider tenancy control but not allowed to, or have you been touched by other things? For the past few years, we all know there's a public housing shortage, and for the next 5 years as well. So for a long-term housing strategy, there's supposed to be a 20,000 units output per year. However, we never hit the target. So when can we catch up the shortfall and return to the right track? Third question, if we attempt to close the lag, suppose it will happen in a few years' time, for those who have been exploited, what can you do for them? So you lay out the difficulties, you listen to the hardship of the residents, but at the end, would you decide to do nothing, or try to do as much as you can? For example, the double stamp duties and special stamp duty, we know that we're all buying time to do things, but then the time is run out. All the adverse consequences have appeared, and yet there's still no adequate supply. We all think that you're taking too long. Before we get to the fundamental solution, what can you do for us in the interim? So I feel for those disadvantaged groups in hardship for 2017-18 to 21-22. Within these 5 periods, we estimated that the complete units will be 99,700 units. That have been growing for the past 5-year cycle. As for the private unit output, we estimated by 2018 to 22, on average, there will be over 20,000 units per year. Compared to 2013 to 17 5-year cycle, an output of 13,500 units per year, there will be increase for both private and public housing supply. I agree that if the measures that within the means of the government and the help of the private sector willing to implement it. As for conduct a strategic review on tenancy control, of course, I've outlined the negative elements, but what are the positives? If we can afford it, through the CSSA, a 4-person household every month they'll be entitled to a 500 plus rent allowance, or for the working family allowance, a 4-person household can be entitled to 3,000 allowance that we would go ahead, because you're directly putting money into the residents' pockets. For other measures, the allowances may be swallowed by the landlords and the intermediaries. Since you feel for the current hardship and yet you claim there's nothing can be done, and we only wait for so many years for it to drop, and for the 2018 to 22 of the output of 20,000 units have failed to catch up the output, the shortfall. Will this condition persist after 2022? So we'll be communicating with the Community Care Fund. And for those disadvantaged families in extra hardship, they will be given appropriate treatment. Time's up. Next, Mr. Poon Siu Ping. Thank you for the deputations for giving their views. Just now, the Secretary claims that the supply imbalance in the housing market. We felt that the waiting time for public housing is extending. So the government seems to be waiting for a stroke of luck for all this to go away. I've always agreed to offer rent subsidy for those on the public housing waiting list, and tenancy control is necessary as well. For all the talk about the vacancy tax, I think we should put some effort to it, or even consider implementing the value-added tax. A multi-pronged approach is needed to address the acute housing shortage. The administration claims that we've done a similar survey back in 2014 and take reference for other countries, and the tenancy control may be counterproductive. That's the view 4 years ago. Now, at 2018, we couldn't identify suitable land, and the waiting queues are extending. So we had rent control before. And we have some legal adjustment as per the prevailing conditions. Will the government face up to the problems squarely? So you understand the public's dilemma and yet could not offer any solution, and hoping to identify enough land for housing. Take reference for the France and the Netherlands example. They do implement the tenancy controls to keep on modifying their controls. So I just saw that you were choking up, especially those who are living in the subdivided units. Would you consider afresh to carry out fresh investigations to analyze the views just received. The deputations, some of them mentioned the new form of tenancy control as a short-term measure. Would the administration consider it? Thank you for Mr. Kun's question. How to make it clear, besides working to increase housing supply, the government did not sit on its hands. We're taking a multi-pronged approach so that in providing housing, social welfare, and social services to provide appropriate assistance to the vulnerable households. And for the qualified persons, they can work through compassionate rehousing and express flat allocation scheme to get on public housing. And those on CSA, when renting public housing or private housing, they'll be entitled to rental allowance to reduce the burden on accommodation. Besides the working family allowance, there's also the working incentive transport scheme. This recurrent cash schemes will provide extra support for the grassroots households. Of course, the views of the deputations present, including on the idea of a good conscious tenancy agreement, as well as the utilities bills, they are explored with the power companies, and they're willing to install electric meters for the subdivided units. And they also have worked through the charities rebate schemes, in which the grassroots household can benefit. Hope that the society can work together to resolve the hardship of the SDO residents. So this session is up. So one of the deputations would like us to discuss our private members' bill. So even though as the chairman I cannot take priority, I would prefer the members to speak first. So I will not take up the meeting time to discuss this. Hopefully I can respond on this at the next session, and thank you all for coming. After 5 minutes, meeting will resume for the second session.